The sound of my phone ringing that afternoon changed everything. I still remember how my hands trembled as I saw Brandon's name flash across the screen. For years, I'd been conditioned to feel fear whenever he called. This time was no different, except for what happened after. "Did you change the card password, you old idiot? Tell me the password before I do something to you." His voice was sharp, cutting through the line like a knife, each word dripping with the contempt he'd mastered over the decades. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the faded wallpaper I'd been meaning to replace for years, just like I'd been meaning to stand up to my son. But something was different this time. Something inside me had finally broken, or perhaps finally healed. My name is Judith Caldwell. I'm 67 years old, and I live in a small blue house on Maple Street in Oak Ridge, Michigan. The same house where I raised Brandon, where I nursed my late husband through cancer, where I've lived my entire adult life. My hands are still shaking as I record this. Not from fear anymore, but from the rawness of finally speaking my truth aloud. For most people, a parent-child relationship is built on love, trust, and mutual respect. Mine was built on manipulation, financial abuse, and fear. It didn't start that way, of course. Brandon was once a bright-eyed little boy who would bring me dandelions from the yard and fall asleep with his head on my lap during thunderstorms. Sometimes I still see glimpses of that child in his face, which makes what I'm about to tell you all the more painful. The pattern started small after his father died. A few dollars missing from my purse. Excuses about why he needed money for this bill or that emergency. I was grieving, vulnerable, and desperate to help my son through his own grief. By the time I recognized the manipulation, it had become our normal. Every month, every week, sometimes every day, Brandon would find a reason why he needed money, and I, desperate to be the mother he needed, would give in. I remember the first time he called me names when I hesitated to help. The shock of hearing my own child speak to me that way paralyzed me. I gave him the money just to make the ugliness stop, and in that moment, I taught him exactly how to control me for the next 15 years. Last month, I sat at my kitchen table with my bank statement spread before me, the numbers blurring through my tears. My retirement account, the one I'd been building since before Brandon was born, was nearly empty. $5,000 withdrawn for what Brandon claimed was a business opportunity. I later discovered from his wife Vanessa, during a rare moment when he wasn't hovering around her, that he'd lost it all at the Pinewood Casino again. That night I couldn't sleep. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror looking at a woman I barely recognized. Gray hair I hadn't bothered to color in months, deep lines etched around eyes that had cried too many tears, shoulders permanently hunched from carrying the weight of my son's problems. "Who are you?" I whispered to my reflection. And for the first time in years, I didn't have an answer. The next morning, I called my oldest friend, Grace Sullivan. We've known each other since high school, been through marriages, births, deaths, and divorces together. "He's killing you, Jude," she said plainly. "No sugarcoating. Not quickly, but surely. And you're letting him." Her words stung because they were true. We sat at the Cozy Corner Cafe, the same booth we've occupied for our weekly coffee dates for 20 years, and she held my hand while I finally admitted what I'd been denying. My son was abusing me, and I needed help. Grace didn't waste time. By that afternoon, she'd connected me with Diane Matthews, a financial advisor specializing in elder financial protection, and set up an appointment with Dr. Raymond Chen, a family therapist who works specifically with parents of adult children with addiction and behavioral problems. My brother Timothy, who had been warning me about Brandon for years, drove up from Ohio the next day. Together they formed a shield around me while I took my first shaky steps toward freedom. With Diane's help, I changed every password, froze my credit cards, and set up new accounts Brandon couldn't access. Dr. Chen helped me understand that what I was experiencing had a name, financial abuse, and that by continuing to enable Brandon, I wasn't helping him. I was helping destroy both of us. Timothy, practical as always, installed security cameras in my home, just in case. At the time, I thought he was being overprotective. I didn't realize how prescient his concern would prove to be. For 2 weeks, I ignored Brandon's increasingly frantic texts and calls, Each one was harder to dismiss than the last. "Mom, the landlord is going to evict us. Vanessa needs medication, Mom. If you ever loved me, you would help me just this one last time." Dr. Chen had me practice responses. "I love you, but I can't help financially anymore. I care about you, but I need to protect myself." Simple phrases that felt like trying to speak a foreign language. Then came that call from Pinewood Mall. I can still hear the ambient noise in the background. People shopping, music playing, life going on normally, while my world tilted on its axis. Brandon's voice, slurring slightly in the way it does when he's been drinking, demanded to know why his card had been declined. When I didn't immediately answer, his tone darkened. "Did you change the card password, you old idiot? Tell me the password before I do something to you." In the past, those words would have sent me scrambling to appease him. I would have given him whatever he wanted just to stop the verbal assault, to prevent the escalation I knew would come if I refused. But as I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, something shifted inside me. A lifetime of maternal instinct screamed at me to protect my child, but another voice, newer, stronger, reminded me that this wasn't protection. This was destruction. "No, Brandon," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I won't be giving you the password. Not today, not ever again." The silence that followed was brief but deafening. Then came the explosion. Threats, insults, promises of what would happen when he got home. I listened, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. But I didn't back down. When he finally hung up, I called Grace, then Timothy, then Officer Morgan at the Oak Ridge Police Department. "He's coming," I told them, the reality of what I'd done finally hitting me. And he's angrier than I've ever heard him. What happened next still feels like something from a movie, not my quiet life in Oak Ridge. While Brandon made his way home, a plan we'd discussed but never thought we'd need was put into motion. Phone calls were made. People arrived. Documents were arranged on my dining room table, the same table where I'd once helped Brandon with his homework, where we'd eaten Sunday dinners as a family, where I'd signed check after check to fund his destructive behaviors. By the time I heard his car screech into the driveway, everything was in place. My hands were shaking, but my resolve wasn't. As I waited for the front door to open, I thought about what Dr. Chen had told me during our last session. True love sometimes means being willing to be hated temporarily to prevent permanent harm. I didn't know if Brandon would ever forgive me for what was about to happen. I didn't know if our relationship could survive what it had become. But for the first time in years, I was certain I was doing the right thing. The door flew open. Brandon stood there, his face contorted with rage, his body tense with the promise of confrontation. He took one step inside, ready to unleash all his fury on me, and then froze as he registered that I wasn't alone. The look that crossed his face in that moment, confusion giving way to understanding, then fear, is something I'll never forget. "Mom," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "What is this?" I took a deep breath and stood up from my chair, feeling the strength of every person in that room behind me. "This is the day everything changes, Brandon," I said. "This is the day I stop being afraid of my own son." The weight of my words hung in the air between us. Brandon's expression shifted from shock to something I hadn't seen in years, vulnerability. The mask of entitlement slipped just for a moment, revealing the lost boy beneath the angry man. "I'm 67 years old and have lived in this house for nearly 4 decades. The walls have absorbed so many whispered prayers, witnessed countless tears, held space for both joy and heartbreak. After losing Richard, my husband of 30 years, to pancreatic cancer, I thought I'd experienced the worst pain life could offer. I was wrong. Watching your child self-destruct while using you as both enabler and scapegoat is a special kind of agony, one that gnaws at your soul day and night. For most of Brandon's adult life, I've been his personal ATM. The pattern started innocently enough. He was 23, just out of college, with a business degree, and full of ambitious plans. "Mom, I need a small loan to get this startup going," he'd said, eyes bright with promise. "I'll pay you back double once we secure investors." That first loan was $10,000, money I'd set aside from Richard's life insurance to renovate the kitchen. Brandon's business sold custom sports equipment online. For 6 months, it seemed legitimate. He'd show me spreadsheets, talk about growth projections, bring me small token repayments that gave me hope. Then came the first bankruptcy. He'd blamed his business partner, a young man I'd never met, despite repeated requests to be introduced. He embezzled everything, Mom. I trusted him and he cleaned us out. I believed him completely. My son, the victim of someone else's greed and dishonesty. How could I not help him get back on his feet? That was the first layer of quicksand I stepped into willingly. Each subsequent emergency pulled me deeper. His car repossessed, rent past due, medical bills that never quite matched any visible illness. Every story was compelling, each crisis seemingly legitimate. And through it all, that look in his eyes, desperate, pleading, occasionally threatening, kept me reaching for my checkbook. When he met Vanessa at 29, I dared to hope things would change. She was sweet, soft-spoken, with a steady job as a dental hygienist. For the first year of their relationship, Brandon held down a job at an insurance company. They moved into a modest apartment. He called me weekly just to chat, not to ask for money. I remember telling Grace during one of our coffee dates, I think he's finally growing up. The relief was indescribable. The wedding was small but beautiful, held at First Community Church of Oak Ridge. I emptied my savings to give them the perfect day, convinced it was an investment in their future stability. 3 months later, Brandon lost his job. Budget cuts, he explained. 6 months after that, Vanessa was working double shifts while Brandon pursued yet another business idea. And once again, he needed seed money. I've emptied my savings, taken loans against my house, even sold my wedding ring, the one Richard slipped onto my finger with tears in his eyes, promising to love me until his last breath. That antique platinum band with the small diamond wasn't worth much in dollars, but it was priceless to me. I sold it last Christmas to buy Brandon and Vanessa out of foreclosure on their house. Brandon had promised it would be the last time he'd need help. I knew he was lying. I knew it, and I gave him the money anyway. There were nights I'd lie awake, calculating how many years I had left to work to make up for the retirement funds I'd depleted. As a school librarian, my pension was modest to begin with. Now, at an age when my friends were traveling or doting on grandchildren, I was picking up weekend shifts at the Cozy Corner Cafe to make ends meet. My arthritic hands would ache after 8 hours of carrying trays and wiping tables, but the pain in my heart was always worse. Last month, everything changed. I was at Maple Street Community Bank depositing my cafe paycheck when Marian, the manager who's known me for 20 years, asked if she could speak to me privately. In her office, she gently closed the door and said words that still echo in my mind. Judith, I'm concerned about the pattern of withdrawals from your accounts. As a mandated reporter for elder financial abuse, I need to ask if these are authorized transactions. Elder abuse. The words felt like a physical blow. Is that what this was? Is that what I'd become? An elderly victim? I'd always pictured victims of such abuse as confused, perhaps suffering from dementia, not someone like me who knowingly wrote the checks. But as Marian showed me the records, $20,000 in the past 3 months alone, the truth became undeniable. I left the bank in a daze, driving aimlessly around Oak Ridge until I found myself parked at Riverside Park. This had been Richard's favorite place. We'd walked here every Sunday for decades, fed the ducks, planned our future. I sat on our bench, I still think of it as ours, and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. If I continued on this path, I would end up destitute, possibly homeless. At my age, with my health issues, that could be a death sentence. But the most painful realization wasn't about money. It was understanding that every dollar I gave Brandon pushed him further into his addiction. Yes, addiction, a word I'd been avoiding for years. Dr. Chen had gently suggested it months ago during a consultation I never followed up on. Gambling addiction often co-occurs with financial exploitation of family members, he'd said. I'd walked out of his office, unwilling to label my son with such a term. Now, sitting on that park bench with Richard's memory beside me, I finally acknowledged the truth, the mysterious disappearances, the inexplicable cash needs. The times I'd called and heard casino announcements in the background before he quickly hung up. Brandon was an addict, and I was his most reliable supplier. I discovered he'd taken $5,000 from my account for what he claimed was a business opportunity. It was the same old story. A friend with connections, a sure thing, triple returns within months. I pretended to believe him because the alternative was confrontation. And confrontation with Brandon always ended the same way, with me giving in after being subjected to emotional warfare. But this time, something broke inside me, or perhaps something healed. I drove straight to Grace's house, arrived on her doorstep in tears, and finally spoke the words I'd been holding back. I need help. My son is destroying both of us, and I don't know how to stop it. Grace, bless her heart, didn't waste a moment on, "I told you so," though she'd been telling me exactly that for years. Instead, she made a pot of tea, sat me down at her kitchen table and said, "We're going to fix this, Judy. Not alone, but together." The next morning, she drove me to Dr. Chen's family counseling office for an emergency appointment. The waiting room was painted a soothing sage green, with comfortable chairs and soft music playing. I remember thinking it didn't look like a place where you'd dismantle your entire relationship with your only child. But that's exactly what happened. Dr. Chen listened without judgment as I poured out 15 years of enabling fear and misplaced maternal devotion. When I finished, hands trembling around a now cold cup of tea, he leaned forward and said something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Caldwell, you didn't cause your son's addiction. You can't control it and you can't cure it, but you are the only one who can stop its impact on your life." I later found out from his wife, Vanessa, that Brandon had lost the money at Pinewood Casino. She called me in tears after he'd left for what he claimed was a job interview. "He was there for 18 hours, Judith," she whispered, as though afraid he might somehow hear her through the phone. "He lost everything. Our rent money, the car payment. He even pawned my mother's necklace." Her voice broke. "I don't know what to do anymore. I love him, but I'm scared all the time." That conversation was the final confirmation I needed. With Grace's support, I contacted Diane Matthews, the financial advisor she'd been recommending for years. Diane's office at Oak Ridge Financial Services was brisk, professional, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos I'd been living in. She didn't mince words as she reviewed my financial situation. "Judith, you've lost approximately $145,000 over the past decade. At the current rate, you'll be completely insolvent within 18 months. She removed her glasses and looked directly at me. "This isn't just financial planning anymore. This is financial triage." That same afternoon, we froze my credit cards, changed all my passwords and PINs, set up new accounts at a different bank, and placed a security freeze on my credit report. Diane helped me draft a budget that would allow me to slowly rebuild some semblance of security, though she was honest about the limitations. "Your full retirement as you once envisioned it isn't recoverable," she explained gently, "but we can prevent further damage and create stability." For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, easily extinguished by doubt and decades of conditioned responses, but it was there. That evening, I called my brother Timothy in Ohio. Our relationship had become strained over the years, largely due to his outspoken criticism of how I handled Brandon. "He's bleeding you dry, Jude," he'd say during our increasingly rare conversations. "You're not helping him. You're helping him destroy himself." When I told Timothy what had happened and the steps I was taking, the relief in his voice was palpable. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said without hesitation. "We'll get through this together." True to his word, he arrived the next day, his pickup truck loaded with tools and a determined expression on his face. By nightfall, he'd installed security cameras at every entrance to my house, set up a new security system, and changed all the locks. "Do you really think that's necessary?" I'd asked, watching him drill into the doorframe. "I hope not," he'd replied, not looking up from his work. "But hope isn't a strategy, Jude. Not with addiction." That night, Brandon called for the first time in 3 days. His voice was casual, almost cheerful, the tone I'd come to recognize as his preamble to asking for money. "Hey, Mom, how are you doing? I've been thinking about you." The familiar dance began. Inquiries about my health, brief updates about his life, all building toward the inevitable request. When it came, it was packaged as concern for Vanessa. She's been having these terrible migraines and our insurance deductible is so high. For the first time in years, I interrupted his well-rehearsed script. I'm not giving you any more money, Brandon. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever again. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought he'd hung up. Then his voice returned, lower, harder. What did you just say to me? I said no more money. My voice shook, but the words were clear. What followed was a tirade so vicious I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Names I won't repeat, threats that made my blood run cold. When he finally hung up, I sat in my kitchen, shaking so hard I could barely dial Grace's number. She came over immediately, stayed the night on my couch, her presence a bulwark against the fear that threatened to drown my newfound resolve. The next day, I did something I'd contemplated many times but never found the courage to do. I went to the Oak Ridge Police Department and spoke with Officer David Morgan about obtaining an order of protection. The station was small, typical for our town, with fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly sickly. Officer Morgan, David as he asked me to call him, had known our family for years. He'd gone to school with Brandon, had watched from a professional distance as my son's life spiraled. I should have come sooner, I said, staring at the forms spread before me, each one requiring me to document specific instances of abuse or threats. Most people don't come until it's almost too late, he replied kindly. You're here now. That's what matters. For nearly 2 hours, I recounted incidents I'd spent years minimizing or excusing. The time Brandon had shoved me against a wall when I'd hesitated to co-sign a loan. The night he'd called 17 times in a row, each message more threatening than the last, because I'd refused to give him cash. The accidents that happened around my house whenever I tried to establish boundaries. Broken dishes, damaged keepsakes, once even a small fire in my garden shed that I could never prove wasn't accidental. When we finished, David looked at me with a mixture of professional concern and personal sadness. This isn't just emotional abuse, Judith. This is criminal behavior. You understand that, right? I nodded, the reality of what I was doing finally setting in. I was taking legal action against my own child. The thought was nearly unbearable, yet somehow less painful than continuing on the path we'd been traveling. For 3 weeks, I maintained radio silence with Brandon, despite his increasingly frantic attempts to contact me. My new phone number was given only to a select few: Grace, Timothy, Dr. Chen, Officer Morgan. I attended twice weekly sessions with Dr. Chen, joined a support group at First Community Church for families of addicts, and slowly began to rediscover parts of myself that had been subsumed by Brandon's needs and demands. That's when the call came from Pinewood Mall, the call that would change everything. When I heard his voice, slurring with what I now recognized as the effects of alcohol, demanding the password to the credit card that was no longer in his name, something inside me solidified. My breaking point had come and gone. In its place was a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Did you change the card password, you old idiot? Tell me the password before I do something to you. The old Judith would have capitulated instantly, terrified of the implied threat, desperate to appease. The woman I was becoming, the woman I'd always been beneath the fear, stood firm. No, Brandon, I said simply. I won't be giving you the password. Not today, not ever again. What followed was a barrage of threats so specific and violent that even through my fear, I recognized their importance as evidence. With shaking hands, I pressed record on my phone, capturing every word. When he finally hung up, promising to deal with me when he got home, I made 4 calls in rapid succession: to Grace, to Timothy, to Officer Morgan, and to Dr. Chen. By the time Brandon's car pulled into my driveway 90 minutes later, everything was in place for what Dr. Chen had helped me understand wasn't revenge, but intervention. Perhaps the first truly maternal act I'd performed for my son in years. What Brandon didn't know as he sped toward my house that evening was that I had been meticulously planning this moment for weeks. Every abusive text, every threatening voicemail, every manipulative interaction, I had documented them all with a thoroughness that surprised even me. The woman who once couldn't say no to her son had transformed into someone who color-coded evidence folders. The journey to this moment began 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon at Dr. Chen's office. I sat across from him, clutching a tissue, having just recounted Brandon's latest financial demand. "Judith," he said, leaning forward slightly, "I want you to consider something difficult. What if the most loving thing you could do for Brandon right now isn't giving him money but giving him consequences?" The concept felt foreign, almost cruel. In my generation, family loyalty was paramount. You didn't air dirty laundry. You certainly didn't withhold help from your child, no matter how old they were. Dr. Chen seemed to read my thoughts. "The definition of love you're operating under was designed for healthy relationships," he explained gently. "But addiction distorts everything it touches. What feels like love to you, the financial rescues, the forgiveness without accountability, actually enables the addiction to thrive." He reached for a notepad and drew a simple diagram, a triangle with labels at each point. Victim, rescuer, persecutor. This is called the Karpman drama triangle. In families affected by addiction, members often rotate through these roles. Right now, you're primarily in the rescuer position, rushing in to save Brandon from the consequences of his actions. When you try to set boundaries, he shifts you to the persecutor role, the cruel mother withholding help. And when that happens, I feel guilty and become the rescuer again, I finished, seeing the pattern with painful clarity. "Exactly. To break this cycle, we need to help you step off the triangle entirely." That session marked the beginning of my education. I learned about enabling versus supporting, about how addiction hijacks the brain's reward system, about the difference between helping and rescuing. Each concept was like a piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for 15 years without knowing what the picture was supposed to look like. The following day, Grace drove me to my first Al-Anon meeting at First Community Church. The basement room was simple, folding chairs arranged in a circle, a coffee station in the corner, pamphlets stacked neatly on a side table. I sat rigid with anxiety, terrified of judgment, of being exposed as the failure of a mother I believed myself to be. Instead, I found understanding. Around that circle sat people from all walks of life: the high school principal, a truck driver, a young woman barely out of her teens, a retired judge, all connected by the common thread of loving someone with addiction. "My name is Alice," said an elegant, silver-haired woman about my age, "and my daughter has been struggling with alcoholism for 22 years. She spoke with a calmness I couldn't fathom, detailing crises that mirrored my own experiences with Brandon. The day I stopped paying her bail was the hardest and most important day of my life as her mother. One by one, they shared their stories, not with self-pity or shame, but with a matter-of-fact acceptance that left me breathless. When my turn came, I could barely speak through tears. "I'm Judith," I managed. "My son he has a gambling problem, and I think I've been making it worse for years." A murmur of understanding rippled through the room. The young woman reached over and squeezed my hand. "You didn't cause it. You can't control it, and you can't cure it," she said, echoing Dr. Chen's words. "But you're in the right place now." I left that meeting with something precious, the knowledge that I wasn't alone. There were others walking this painful path, and some had found a way forward that didn't include self-destruction. The next morning, Timothy and I met with Diane Matthews at her office. The financial picture she painted was grim, but not hopeless. "Based on my analysis," she said, sliding a spreadsheet across her desk, "Brandon has extracted approximately $145,000 from you over the past decade. That doesn't include indirect costs like higher insurance premiums after you added him to your policies, or the home equity you've lost by taking loans against your property." The number struck me like a physical blow. $145,000. Nearly 3 years of my salary as a school librarian. Money that should have been my security in old age. "Can any of it be recovered?" Timothy asked, his voice tight with the anger he was trying to contain for my sake. Diane's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "Some, potentially. If Brandon took out loans in Judith's name without her knowledge, that's fraud. If he manipulated her while she was in a vulnerable state, after her husband's death, for instance, we might make a case for undue influence. But realistically, Legal recovery would be lengthy, expensive, and it would mean pressing charges against my son. I finished for her. She nodded. For now, let's focus on protection rather than recovery. We need to ensure that not another dollar leaves your accounts without your fully informed consent. Together, we created a financial lockdown plan. New accounts at a different bank, credit freezes, removal of Brandon as a beneficiary on my insurance policies and retirement accounts. Each action felt simultaneously like a betrayal of my son and an act of long overdue self-preservation. As Timothy drove me home, he broke the heavy silence. You know he's going to be furious when he realizes what you've done. I nodded, watching the familiar streets of Oak Ridge pass by. Streets where I'd pushed Brandon on a tricycle, taught him to ride a bike, later taught him to drive. I know. Jude? Timothy's voice was hesitant, uncharacteristically tentative. Have you considered that his reaction could be more than just angry words? I turned to look at my brother's profile, so similar to our father's. You think he might hurt me? It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. I think addiction makes people desperate, and desperate people do things they wouldn't normally do. That afternoon, Timothy installed security cameras at every entrance to my house. He added motion detector lights, replaced the flimsy locks on my windows with sturdy pins, and programmed the Oak Ridge Police Department's number as a one-touch dial on my new phone. As I watched him work, a memory surfaced. Brandon at 7 years old, helping Timothy build a treehouse in our backyard, his small face serious with concentration as he handed up tools. The contrast between that eager boy and the man we were now fortifying my home against was almost unbearable. The following day brought another critical piece of the intervention plan. Officer Morgan visited my home, bringing with him Sarah Bennett, a victim advocate from the county's domestic violence program. Elder abuse cases often overlap with domestic violence, Sarah explained, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. The dynamics of power and control are similar, even when it's a child abusing a parent rather than a partner abusing a spouse. Officer Morgan nodded. Based on what you've shared, Judith, we have grounds for an emergency protective order. This would legally bar Brandon from contacting you, coming to your home, or accessing your finances in any way. I hesitated, the weight of what they were suggesting pressing on my chest. If I do this, if I take out this order, what happens to Brandon? Sarah and Officer Morgan exchanged a glance I couldn't quite interpret. He'll be served with the order, Officer Morgan explained. If he violates it, by calling you, coming here, or making threats, he can be arrested. Arrested, I repeated, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. My son. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes kind but direct. Judith, I've worked with families in your situation for 15 years. One thing I've learned is that legal consequences are often the first real boundary an addict encounters. For some, it's the wake-up call they've needed. And for others? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. For others, it escalates the situation temporarily. That's why the security measures your brother installed are important. But in either case, it breaks the cycle. And breaking the cycle is the first step toward healing for both of you. I signed the paperwork with a hand that trembled less than I expected. As Sarah gathered the forms, she handed me a small device that resembled a key fob. This is a panic button, she explained. It connects directly to the police dispatch. Keep it with you at all times, especially during the first few weeks after Brandon is served with the order. After they left, I sat in my quiet living room, the panic button a heavy presence in my pocket. What had my life become that I needed such a thing to protect me from my own child? The despair that threatened to overwhelm me was interrupted by a text from Grace. Al-Anon, 7 p.m., I'll pick you up. No excuses. That evening's meeting focused on a concept that would become central to my journey: detachment with love. It doesn't mean you stop caring, explained the group facilitator, a soft-spoken man named Michael, whose son had been in recovery for 6 years. It means you separate the person from the addiction. You love the person but refuse to participate in the addiction. How? I asked, the single word containing oceans of doubt. How do you watch someone you love self-destruct and not try to stop it? An older woman across the circle smiled sadly. You recognize that your attempts to stop it have become part of the problem. You accept that they must find their own bottom. And you pray that when they do, they'll choose to climb back up instead of digging deeper. I left that meeting with a mantra I would repeat countless times in the coming weeks. Detach with love, detach with love, detach with love. Sometimes it felt like a lifeline. Other times, like a betrayal of everything I thought motherhood meant. The next major piece of the intervention fell into place when I received an unexpected call from Vanessa. Her voice was hushed, fearful. Can we meet somewhere? Somewhere Brandon wouldn't think to look? We arranged to meet at the public library where I'd worked for 30 years. In the quiet of the local history room, surrounded by archives of Oak Ridge's past, Vanessa unfolded a story that broke my heart anew. It's not just gambling, she confessed, her eyes darting nervously toward the door, despite the fact that Brandon was supposedly at a job interview across town. It's the drinking too, and the rage when he loses. Last week, She pulled up her sleeve to reveal a bracelet of bruises around her wrist. My stomach lurched. Has he done this before? She nodded, tears spilling. It's getting worse. The more he loses, the angrier he gets. Sometimes I think he doesn't even see me anymore. I'm just another thing that's failing him, like the cards or the dice or you when you don't give him money. In that moment, the intervention expanded. It wasn't just about saving myself or even trying to help Brandon. It was about protecting Vanessa too, this sweet young woman who had married my son, expecting a partner and found herself with a jailer instead. Together, we contacted a domestic violence shelter in the next county. They helped Vanessa create an exit plan, a separate bank account, copies of important documents, a packed bag hidden at her mother's house. Just in case, the advocate assured her. Having a plan doesn't mean you have to use it, but having no plan can be dangerous. As Vanessa prepared to leave, she hesitated. Judith, there's something else you should know. She pulled a stack of mail from her purse. Bills, collection notices, legal threats. He's been intercepting your mail. Anything that looks financial, he takes. He's opened credit cards in your name, taken out payday loans. There's a second mortgage on your house that I don't think you know about. My knees weakened, and I gripped the library table for support. Identity theft, fraud, crimes with real consequences committed by my son against me. The final illusion that Brandon's problems were solely addiction, that deep down he wouldn't deliberately harm me, shattered. The next day was a blur of activity. Timothy drove me to the police station where I filed formal reports of identity theft and fraud. Officer Morgan documented each incident, his expression growing grimmer with each new detail. Judith, he said finally, these aren't misdemeanors. The dollar amounts push several of these into felony territory. I nodded, numb. I understand. If we pursue these charges, and I strongly recommend we do, Brandon could be looking at significant jail time. Jail. My son. The thought was almost unbearable. But the alternative, continuing to allow him to destroy himself, Vanessa and me, had become even more unthinkable. For the next 2 weeks, I gathered evidence with methodical precision. Bank statements, recorded phone calls, photographs of forged signatures. Each piece was carefully filed in colored folders, red for financial abuse, blue for identity theft, green for threatening communications, yellow for the incidents involving Vanessa. Every abusive text, every threatening voicemail, I saved them all. My brother Timothy helped me install security cameras in my home. The footage they captured would later prove crucial. Brandon appearing at night, trying doors and windows, once standing in my backyard at 3 a.m. Just staring at my bedroom window, images that chilled me to the bone but strengthened my resolve. Officer Morgan from the Oak Ridge Police had been documenting the pattern of financial abuse. He connected me with a detective specializing in elder fraud, who built a case file that grew sicker by the day. Dr. Chen, my therapist, helped me understand that what was happening wasn't love, it was exploitation. For 3 weeks, I met with a lawyer, filed reports, and prepared documentation of everything Brandon had taken from me over the years. I also reached out to Pinewood Casino's security department. With a police report in hand, they agreed to share their surveillance footage of Brandon's activities. The images were heartbreaking. My son, pacing frantically between slot machines, drinking heavily, becoming increasingly agitated as losses mounted. In one particularly disturbing sequence, he could be seen making the very phone call to me that had precipitated this final intervention, his face contorted with desperation and rage. When I heard him threaten me on that call from the mall, I pressed record and added it to my evidence. The audio file joined dozens of others, a damning chronicle of verbal abuse that made even the hardened detective wince. As the intervention day approached, I experienced moments of paralyzing doubt. Was I betraying my son? Was there a less drastic way to help him? In those moments, I would return to Dr. Chen's office, to the support of my Al-Anon group, to the growing strength I found in setting boundaries. The intervention isn't the end, Dr. Chen reminded me during our final session before the confrontation. It's the beginning of a new relationship with your son, one based on truth rather than manipulation, one where genuine healing becomes possible. On the morning of the intervention, I woke before dawn, my mind surprisingly calm. I dressed carefully in clothes that made me feel strong, a blue sweater Richard had always loved, comfortable shoes in case I needed to move quickly, the simple pearl earrings that had been my mother's, small armor but meaningful. Grace arrived first, bringing coffee and a quiet solidarity that required no words. Timothy came next, setting up the final camera that would record the intervention itself. For protection, he insisted, legal and otherwise. My lawyer arrived precisely at 9 a.m., bringing with him copies of the restraining order, the financial documentation, and a clear explanation of the choices Brandon would face. Officer Morgan came in uniform, a visual reminder of the legal consequences now in play. He positioned himself discreetly in the corner of my living room, present but not threatening. By 10 a.m., everything was in place. The folders were arranged neatly on my dining room table. A treatment center 2 counties over had a bed on hold, ready to accept Brandon if he chose that path. Vanessa waited at her mother's house, ready to come if Brandon agreed to the intervention, but safely distant if he didn't, and then we waited. The call from Pinewood Mall came at 2:17 p.m. Brandon, desperate and threatening because his card had been declined. When I refused to give him the password, his rage had exploded with a violence that would have once sent me scrambling to appease him. Instead, it strengthened my resolve. As his car pulled into my driveway 90 minutes later, I took a deep breath and reminded myself of what Dr. Chen had told me. This is an act of love, Judith. Perhaps the most genuine act of love you've offered your son in years. I stood in my living room surrounded by people who supported my journey toward health and prepared to face my only child with a truth that might save us both or drive us apart forever. When Brandon burst through my front door that evening, the sound reverberated through my home like a thunderclap. I can still hear the wood striking the wall, the rattle of pictures I'd hung decades ago. Brandon's school photos, our family vacations, memories of happier times now trembling in their frames. His face was red with rage, a vein pulsing at his temple. The transformation from the sweet-faced boy in those photos to this man consumed by fury and addiction was jarring, even after all these years. He stormed into the entryway, his movements jerky and unpredictable, like a marionette with tangled strings. The smell of alcohol followed him, a sour cloud that had become as familiar to me as his voice. "You think you can just cut me off?" he shouted, not even fully through the door. "After everything I've done for you?" The irony of his words might have made me laugh if the situation weren't so heartbreaking. What exactly had he done for me, except drain my accounts and fill my nights with anxiety? I stood my ground in the center of my living room, fighting every maternal instinct that screamed at me to soothe him, to placate him, to return to our destructive pattern. My legs were shaking beneath my slacks, but I kept my spine straight, channeling Grace's calm strength, Timothy's protective resolve. Brandon took 3 more steps into my home before he registered that I wasn't alone. His forward momentum halted abruptly as his eyes darted from face to face. Officer Morgan by the window, Timothy standing slightly in front of me, Grace perched on the edge of the sofa, my lawyer seated at the dining table with his folders neatly arranged. The rage on Brandon's face flickered, momentarily replaced by confusion, then suspicion. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. He'd always been like that, even as a teenager, loudest just before he felt cornered, then quiet in a way that was somehow more frightening than the yelling. I can still see the vase shattering as he knocked it off the entryway table. It was nothing special, just a blue glass piece I'd found at a thrift store, but I'd filled it with fresh daisies that morning in a small act of self-care. The flowers lay scattered now, water seeping into the hardwood Richard had installed the summer before Brandon was born. "Mom," Brandon said, ignoring the others, focusing his manipulation where it had always been most effective. "What's going on? Why are these people here?" His tone shifted, aiming for wounded bewilderment but missing the mark. The performance might have worked a month ago. Today, I saw through it like glass. "Sit down, Brandon," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "We need to talk." His eyes narrowed, darting toward Officer Morgan with newfound wariness. "Is this some kind of intervention? Because I don't have a problem." "If anyone has a problem, it's you. Changing passwords, freezing accounts that I should have access to." Timothy tensed beside me, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm. This was my confrontation to lead. "The accounts are in my name, Brandon. The money is mine. And yes, this is an intervention, but not the kind you're thinking." "Ma'am," Officer Morgan said quietly, "would you like me to explain the legal situation?" Brandon's head snapped toward him. "Legal situation? What legal situation?" His voice rose again, the brief moment of control evaporating. "What have you been telling these people, Mom? What lies have you been spreading about me?" I felt a familiar tremor of doubt, the ingrained urge to back down, to apologize, to keep the peace at any cost. Dr. Chen had warned me about this moment, the point where setting boundaries feels worse than the pain of having none. I took a deep breath and pushed through it. "No lies, Brandon. Only truths we've both been avoiding for too long." I gestured toward the dining table. "Please sit down. There are things you need to hear, decisions you need to make." He remained standing, defiant, his body language screaming fight or flight. I recognized the look in his eyes, the trapped animal searching for escape. How many times had I given him one? How many opportunities to avoid consequences had my misguided love provided? "I'm not sitting anywhere until you tell these people to leave. This is between you and me. Family business." He spat the word family like it was poison on his tongue, weaponizing the very connection he'd exploited for years. "That's not going to happen," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Not this time." Brandon took a step towards me, his hands clenched into fists. Timothy immediately moved to intercept him, and Officer Morgan straightened from his position by the window. "Sir," Officer Morgan said, his professional tone underlaid with steel, "I strongly suggest you take a seat and listen to what your mother has to say. Your other options at this moment are limited, and none of them end well for you." Something in Officer Morgan's tone, or perhaps the uniform, the implied authority, penetrated Brandon's anger. He hesitated, then stalked to the armchair furthest from the dining table, flinging himself into it with the petulant body language I recognized from his teenage years. "Fine. Say whatever you need to say so I can get out of here." His dismissive words contrasted sharply with the nervous bobbing of his knee, the way his eyes couldn't quite settle on any of us. I walked to the dining table, my lawyer sliding one of the red folders toward me. Taking it, I returned to stand before my son. The living room where he'd opened Christmas presents, watched Saturday morning cartoons, built blanket forts on rainy days, now transformed into a courtroom of sorts. The weight of what I was about to do pressed on my chest like a stone. "Brandon," I began, opening the folder. "Over the past 15 years, you've taken approximately $145,000 from me through various means. Some I agreed to under duress, others without my knowledge or consent." He scoffed, though I caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. "That's ridiculous. I've borrowed money, sure, but nothing like that amount. And I've always intended to pay it back when my situation improves." "Your situation will never improve as long as you continue gambling," I said, the word hanging in the air between us. We'd never named it so directly before. This beast that had devoured our relationship, one chip, one card, one desperate request at a time. His face hardened. "I don't have a gambling problem. From the folder, I withdrew bank statements, credit card bills, loan documents, a paper trail of destruction meticulously organized by date. Pinewood Casino's records indicate you visited 147 times in the past year alone. Their surveillance footage shows you were there for 18 hours straight the day before yesterday. The color drained from Brandon's face. You've been spying on me. The accusation was weak, defensive. A child caught with his hand in the cookie jar, attempting to shift blame. No, Brandon. I've been protecting myself. I laid the financial documents on the coffee table between us. These are copies of loans taken out in my name without my knowledge. Credit cards opened using my social security number. A second mortgage on this house with a forged signature that looks nothing like mine. His eyes darted to the papers, then away. The denial that had worked so effectively for years was crumbling in the face of documented evidence. Officer Morgan, I said, not taking my eyes off my son, could you explain the legal implications? The officer stepped forward, his presence solid and reassuring. Mr. Caldwell, what I'm seeing here constitutes multiple felonies. Identity theft, fraud, elder financial abuse. The dollar amounts push this into territory that typically results in significant jail time. Brandon's face contorted, fear breaking through the mask of indignation. Jail? You'd send your own son to jail? After everything we've been through together? He turned to me, voice cracking with what might have been genuine emotion or merely another manipulation tactic. I couldn't tell anymore. And perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of all, that I could no longer recognize truth in my own child's voice. I don't want to send you to jail, I said softly. That's why we're here today, like this, instead of at the police station. My lawyer cleared his throat, a gentle reminder of the script we'd prepared. I nodded my thanks and continued. Brandon, you have two options. I placed another folder on the table, this one containing brochures from the treatment center we'd contacted. Option 1. You enter a comprehensive treatment program for gambling addiction. The program lasts 90 days, followed by mandatory outpatient therapy and regular attendance at Gamblers Anonymous meetings. He stared at the brochures, his expression unreadable. And option 2? His voice was barely audible. Option 2, I press charges for the financial crimes committed against me. Officer Morgan takes you into custody today, and the legal process begins. The silence that followed was deafening. In it, I could hear echoes of every argument we'd ever had, every tearful promise he'd broken, every late night I'd spent wondering where I'd gone wrong as a mother. This is blackmail, Brandon finally said, though the fire had gone out of his voice. This is consequence, I corrected gently. Something I've shielded you from for far too long. His hands were trembling now, a detail that pierced my heart despite everything. My child was frightened, and every fiber of my being wanted to comfort him. But Dr. Chen's words echoed in my mind. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is allow someone to face the truth of their situation. I can't just drop everything and go to rehab for 3 months, Brandon protested, grasping for practical obstacles. What about my job? What about Vanessa? You haven't had steady employment in over a year, Timothy interjected, his patience visibly wearing thin. As for Vanessa knows about this intervention, I said, cutting off what I feared might become an unhelpful confrontation between brother and nephew. She supports it. She's staying with her mother until you make your decision. Brandon's head snapped up. You've been talking to my wife behind my back? Turning her against me too? I reached for the yellow folder containing the photographs of Vanessa's bruises, the documentation of the verbal abuse she'd endured, but stopped myself. Shame wouldn't help Brandon toward healing. It would only push him further into defensive anger. Instead, I knelt before him, bringing my eyes level with his, close enough to see the broken capillaries from too much drinking, the shadows of sleepless nights spent chasing losses. No one has been turned against you, Brandon. We're all here because we want you to get better. I hesitated, then added the truth he needed to hear. But we can no longer wait for you to hit rock bottom on your own. You're taking too many people down with you. He looked away, staring out the window toward the oak tree in the front yard, where his childhood swing still hung, rope frayed but sturdy. For a moment I glimpsed vulnerability in his profile, a fleeting echo of the sensitive boy who'd once rescued injured birds and cried at sad movies. "And if I agree to this rehab thing," he said finally, still not meeting my eyes, "what happens to the charges? To all of—" He gestured vaguely at the folders on the table. "That?" My lawyer stepped in, his voice calm and precise. "The documentation remains sealed unless you fail to complete the treatment program or commit any further financial improprieties against your mother. Think of it as a suspended sentence, contingent upon your compliance and recovery efforts." Brandon rubbed his hands over his face, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that it made my chest ache. "Do I have time to think about it?" "No," I said firmly. "The treatment center has a bed available today. If you choose that option, Timothy will drive you there immediately. If not, Officer Morgan will escort you to the station to process the charges." "Today? Right now?" Panic edged his voice. I need to get some things, talk to Vanessa, sort out." "Everything you need for treatment will be provided," I explained. "Vanessa can bring personal items once you're settled. But the decision must be made now, Brandon." He stood abruptly, pacing the small confines of the living room like a caged animal. "This isn't fair. None of this is fair." "No," I agreed softly. "Addiction isn't fair. What it's done to you, to Vanessa, to me, none of it is fair. But it is real, and it won't get better until you get help." Brandon stopped pacing, his back to me, shoulders hunched against a burden that had grown too heavy to carry alone. In the silence, I could almost hear the battle raging within him, addiction fighting for survival against the possibility of recovery. When he finally turned to face me, his eyes were wet with tears I hadn't seen him shed since childhood. "I don't know if I can do this, Mom," he whispered, the bravado stripped away, leaving only raw fear in its place. The maternal instinct to rescue him surged within me, nearly overwhelming in its intensity. How easy it would be to say, "It's okay, we'll figure something else out." How familiar that path of least resistance. Instead, I reached for his hand, not to pull him back into our dysfunctional dance, but to guide him toward a new beginning. "You can't do it alone," I said. "That's why there are programs, professionals, others who understand what you're going through." "But you can do it, Brandon, I believe that. I wouldn't be putting us both through this if I didn't." He looked down at our joined hands, then at the folders containing evidence of his crimes, the brochures promising a different future. The decision played out across his face. Denial, anger, bargaining, all the stages of grief for the life addiction had convinced him he wanted. "Will you?" His voice cracked. "Will you still be here when I get out?" The question broke something open inside me. Hope, fragile but persistent, unfurling its tender leaves after a long winter. "Yes," I promised. "Not as your enabler, not as your bank, but as your mother. Always as your mother." He nodded just once, a quick jerk of his head, as though the movement might betray further emotion. "Then I'll go. To the treatment center." The relief that washed over the room was palpable. Timothy's shoulders relaxed. Grace smiled softly from her position on the sofa. Even Officer Morgan's professional demeanor softened slightly. My lawyer began gathering the treatment paperwork Brandon would need to sign. "I'll get my car," Timothy said, giving my shoulder a gentle squeeze as he passed. Brandon remained standing in the center of the room, looking suddenly young and lost. Can I talk to Vanessa before I go?" I nodded. "Of course. I'll call her." As I reached for my phone, Brandon's voice stopped me. "Mom?" I turned back to him. This man-child of mine, seeing both the addict who had terrorized me and the son I had never stopped loving, somehow coexisting in the same broken vessel. "I'm sorry," he said, the words small but sincere. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am." "I know," I replied, my own vision blurring with tears. "This is the first step toward fixing things, Brandon, not the last." As Timothy and Officer Morgan prepared to transport Brandon to the treatment center, I stood in my living room, surrounded by the evidence of years of pain and manipulation. Yet alongside that pain, something new was taking root. Not forgiveness, not yet, but its precursor, hope. Hope that beneath the layers of addiction and deception, some essential part of my son remained intact. Hope that with proper treatment, that part might grow strong enough to reclaim his life. The confrontation I had feared for so long was over. The real work for both of us was just beginning. I'd never seen my son speechless before. As I laid out the terms, rehab for his gambling addiction, therapy for his anger, repayment of what he'd stolen, and a legal agreement to never threaten me again, his shoulders slumped in a way that made him appear smaller than I'd seen him in years. The facade of control, of righteous indignation had finally crumbled. After Brandon left with Timothy and Officer Morgan to go to the treatment facility, I stood alone in my living room, the silence surrounding me like a physical presence. Grace had offered to stay, but I needed this moment to myself, to breathe, to process, to begin the delicate work of rebuilding my life without the constant drain of Brandon's addiction pulling me under. The daisies from the shattered vase still lay scattered across my hardwood floor. I knelt slowly, my knees protesting as I gathered each stem, each fallen petal. Such a small thing. These flowers I'd bought myself as a symbol of a new beginning. Now they were broken, just like so much else in my life. But as I collected them, I realized something. Though bent and damaged, most of the blooms were salvageable. I found a mason jar under the sink, filled it with water, and arranged the survivors on my kitchen windowsill. Imperfect, but still beautiful, still alive. That first night alone was strange, frightening in its stillness, yet liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, I didn't jump when my phone rang. I didn't mentally calculate how much cash I had available when I heard a car pull into my driveway. I slept deeply, dreamlessly, waking only when sunlight streamed through my curtains. On the third day after the intervention, Vanessa came to see me. She looked different already, standing straighter, her eyes clearer, though still shadowed with worry. "I spoke to Brandon yesterday," she said, accepting the tea I offered. We sat at my kitchen table, the afternoon light gentle on her face. "He's actually participating. The counselor said he was resistant at first, but he's starting to talk in group sessions." I nodded, careful not to let hope surge too quickly. "That's a good sign." "It is." She wrapped her hands around the mug, seeking its warmth. "I've been going to Al-Anon too, and talking to a therapist at the Women's Center." She hesitated. "I'm not sure what's going to happen with us, with our marriage. They said not to make any major decisions during the first year of his recovery." "That seems wise," I said, though privately I wondered if Brandon and Vanessa's relationship could survive the truth-telling that real recovery would demand. "What will you do in the meantime?" "Stay with my mom, work extra shifts at the dental office, try to untangle the financial mess." She looked up at me, her eyes suddenly filling with tears. "I'm so sorry, Judith. I knew what he was doing to you. Maybe not the extent of it, but I knew, and I didn't stop it." I reached across the table to take her hand. "You couldn't have stopped it, Vanessa. Neither could I. Until now." I squeezed her fingers gently. "We're both learning that loving an addict means loving ourselves enough to set boundaries." She nodded, wiping away tears with her free hand. "The counselor at Al-Anon said something similar. She said enabling isn't love. It's fear dressed up as love." That sounds about right. We sat in companionable silence, drinking our tea, two women united by love for the same troubled man, now united by our parallel journeys toward healing. Before she left, Vanessa hugged me tightly. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "Whatever happens with Brandon, you and I are going to be okay." I held on to those words in the weeks that followed, weeks that stretched into the strange new landscape of my life after intervention. A life that was simultaneously emptier and fuller than before. The empty spaces were obvious. No more chaotic visits from Brandon, no more late-night phone calls demanding money, no more walking on eggshells in my own home. But those spaces began to fill with unexpected gifts. Grace coming over for movie nights without the evening being interrupted by Brandon's crises. Timothy calling just to chat, the tension gone from his voice now that he wasn't constantly worried about me. Lunches with former colleagues from the library who drifted away during the worst years of Brandon's addiction, when I'd been too ashamed or too exhausted to maintain friendships. I returned to Al-Anon 3 times a week, finding solace in the wisdom of others who understood the particular grief of loving someone with addiction. In those church basement meetings, I learned a new vocabulary for my experiences. detachment, boundaries, self-care, recovery. Words that had once seemed selfish or foreign now became touchstones for rebuilding my life. Dr. Chen continued to guide me through the emotional aftermath of the intervention. "What you're feeling now is normal," he assured me during a particularly difficult session when the guilt and doubt were threatening to overwhelm my resolve. "You've disrupted a long-established pattern. Your nervous system is literally rewiring itself to exist without constant crisis." Sometimes I miss him, I confessed, the words feeling like a betrayal of everything I'd worked toward. Not the chaos or the abuse, but him, the child he was, the man he could have been. Dr. Chen nodded, his expression compassionate. "That's grief, Judith. You're mourning the relationship you deserve to have with your son, the one addiction stole from both of you. That grief is valid and important." 30 days after the intervention, I received my first letter from Brandon. The treatment center restricted phone calls during the initial phase of recovery, but encouraged written communication as part of the therapeutic process. I recognized his handwriting on the envelope, the same slightly cramped style I'd seen on birthday cards and school assignments over the years. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Dear Mom, they have us writing letters as part of our making amends work here. I'm not supposed to send this until my counselor approves it, so if you're reading this, I guess I said the right things. The first week here was hell. I was so angry at you, at Timothy, at everyone who put me here. I told myself you were overreacting, that my gambling wasn't that bad, that I could have fixed everything without this extreme step. I hated you for what felt like betrayal." Then the withdrawal hit. "Did you know gambling addiction causes physical withdrawal?" I didn't. The headaches, the panic attacks, the nightmares, they were worse than I could have imagined. During one particularly bad night, when I was sweating and shaking and convinced I was dying, my roommate, who's been here 60 days, said something that finally got through to me. "Your body doesn't react this way to losing something you don't need." That was the first crack in my denial. Since then, I've been doing the work, really doing it, not just going through the motions, and I'm starting to see how much damage I've caused, to Vanessa, to you, to myself. The counselors had me create a financial impact statement, tallying up everything I've taken from you over the years. Seeing that number on paper made me physically sick. I don't know if you can ever forgive me. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know that for the first time in years, I'm completely sober. I'm seeing clearly, and I'm so sorry for what I've put you through. Your son, Brandon." I read the letter 3 times, my emotions swinging wildly between hope and skepticism, between maternal love and hard-earned caution. I'd heard promises from Brandon before, heartfelt vows to change that evaporated like morning dew once the immediate crisis had passed. Was this different? Could it be? I took the letter to my next Al-Anon meeting, sharing it with the group that had become my second family. Alice, the silver-haired woman whose daughter had been in recovery for years, listened carefully before speaking. "The letter sounds promising," she said, choosing her words with care. "And it's okay to feel hopeful. But remember, recovery isn't a straight line. There will be setbacks, difficult days. Your job isn't to manage his recovery, it's to continue yours." I nodded, grateful for the gentle reminder. "One day at a time," I said, echoing the mantra that had carried me through the darkest moments of this journey. "One day at a time," the group repeated in unison. As Brandon's treatment progressed, I began the daunting task of reconstructing my financial life. Diane Matthews, true to her word, helped me navigate the complexity of identity theft recovery, credit repair, and long-term planning with what remained of my assets. The picture wasn't pretty. At 67, I was far from the comfortable retirement I'd once envisioned. But it wasn't hopeless either. "We'll need to be creative," Diane said during one of our strategy sessions. "You may need to work part-time longer than you'd planned. We should look into whether you qualify for any assistance programs. And once the dust settles, we might consider legal avenues to recover some of what was taken." "I don't want to press charges against Brandon," I said firmly. "Not if he's genuinely working on recovery." Diane nodded, respecting my decision, though I suspected she disagreed with it. "There are other options, civil judgments, structured repayment plans. But let's focus on stabilizing your situation first. To that end, I took a part-time position, at the Cozy Corner Cafe, where I'd once worked weekends out of desperation. Now, I found unexpected joy in the routine, the familiar faces of regular customers, the simple satisfaction of being useful, the small but steady paychecks that were wholly mine to control. 3 days a week, I served coffee and pie to the people of Oak Ridge, many of whom had known me for decades but had no idea of the private battles I'd been fighting. 60 days into Brandon's treatment, I was permitted to visit the center for a supervised family session. Timothy drove me the 2 hours to Riverside Recovery, a sprawling facility situated on what had once been a small college campus. The grounds were peaceful, towering oaks, well-maintained gardens, walkways winding between brick buildings that housed different aspects of the treatment program. Brandon was waiting for us in a sunny room designated for family meetings, a counselor seated discreetly in the corner. I barely recognized my son. He'd lost weight, but it was healthy weight. The bloating from alcohol gone, his face more defined. His eyes were clear, his movements purposeful rather than jittery. When he stood to greet me, his posture was open, without the defensive hunch I'd grown accustomed to. "Mom," he said simply, his voice catching on the single syllable. I hesitated only a moment before stepping forward to embrace him. He felt solid in my arms, present in a way he hadn't been for years. When we pulled apart, both of us had tears in our eyes. The session that followed was simultaneously one of the most difficult and most honest conversations we'd ever had. Guided by his counselor, Brandon walked me through his descent into addiction, the first casual bets that gave him a rush he'd been chasing ever since, the escalating risks, the shame that drove him deeper into the cycle, the rationalizations he'd constructed to justify exploiting me financially. "I told myself I deserved your help," he admitted, his gaze steady on mine despite the obvious difficulty of the confession. "That after Dad died, you owed me that support, that someday I'd win big and pay you back with interest. I actually believed that, even as the debts piled up. The disease distorted everything. My thinking, my values, my love for you and Vanessa." I nodded, my own therapy having prepared me to hear these painful truths without absorbing them as personal failures. "Addiction is a family disease," I said quietly. "It affected my thinking too, made me believe that rescuing you was the same as loving you." Brandon's counselor, a gentle-voiced woman named Leslie, guided us through an exercise in which we each identified specific behaviors we were committed to changing. Brandon's list was long, gambling obviously, but also dishonesty, manipulation, verbal abuse, financial exploitation. Mine was shorter but equally important: enabling, denial, misplaced guilt, boundary violations. "Recovery is a parallel process," Leslie explained. "Brandon is working on his addiction. You're working on the patterns that developed in response to that addiction. Neither journey happens in isolation." As the session drew to a close, Leslie outlined the next phase of Brandon's treatment, the transition to a sober living facility where he would have more independence while continuing outpatient therapy and daily Gamblers Anonymous meetings. The structure would include finding employment, financial counseling, and gradually rebuilding relationships damaged by his addiction. "What about restitution?" Brandon asked, looking directly at me. "I've taken so much from you, Mom. I need to make that right somehow." Leslie nodded approvingly. "Restitution is an important part of recovery, but it needs to be realistic and sustainable. We'll work together to create a plan that addresses the harm without setting Brandon up for failure." As Timothy and I prepared to leave, Brandon walked us to the main entrance of the facility. The October air was crisp, leaves crunching beneath our feet on the pathway. Before we reached the parking lot, Brandon stopped. "I know I have a long way to go," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "And I know words don't mean much after all the promises I've broken, but I want you to know that for the first time in my adult life, I feel clear, like I'm finally awake after a long, horrible dream." I studied my son's face, seeing traces of the boy he'd been, glimpses of the man he might become, and the reality of who he was in this moment, imperfect, damaged, but fighting for his life with a courage I hadn't known he possessed. "One day at a time," I said, echoing the wisdom that had sustained me through my own journey. Brandon smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "One day at a time," he repeated. Driving home with Timothy, watching the autumn landscape blur past the window, I felt a subtle shift within me. Not the dramatic euphoria of a happy ending, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that whatever happened next, I had reclaimed my power, my voice, my life. The future remained uncertain. Brandon's recovery wasn't guaranteed. The financial damage couldn't be undone overnight. But for the first time in years, I was facing that uncertainty from a place of strength rather than fear. That evening, alone in my house, that finally felt like my home again, I stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the oak tree in my yard. The tree had weathered countless storms, lost limbs, endured seasons of drought and flood. Yet it remained, scarred but standing, roots deep, reaching skyward despite everything it had endured. In its resilience, I recognized my own. 3 months have passed since that pivotal day when Brandon burst through my front door expecting to find me alone and vulnerable, only to walk into the intervention that would change both our lives forever. The journey since then has been neither straight nor easy, but it has been transformative in ways I never imagined possible. I'm sitting now in the same living room where our confrontation took place, but everything feels different. The air is lighter somehow, no longer heavy with anticipation of the next crisis. The phone on the side table is just a phone, not a potential harbinger of demands or threats. My home has become a sanctuary rather than a battleground, and I've rediscovered the simple joy of peace within these walls. Brandon completed his 90-day inpatient treatment program last week. The treatment center staff recommended he transition to a sober living facility for at least 6 months, and to my surprise and relief, he agreed without hesitation. "I'm not ready to be on my own yet," he told me during my final visit to Riverside Recovery. "I need the structure, the accountability. I need to prove to myself that I can live without gambling before I try to prove it to anyone else." That self-awareness alone marks a profound change from the son who just months ago denied having any problem at all. His counselor calls it the gift of desperation, the clarity that sometimes comes only when every other option has been exhausted. Brandon reached that point on my living room floor, confronted with the consequences of years of addiction and the ultimatum that forced him to choose between recovery and legal repercussions. Vanessa has been attending Al-Anon meetings regularly, sometimes joining me at First Community Church, other times finding her own path at a group closer to her mother's home. We've developed a friendship independent of Brandon, 2 women healing from similar wounds, learning to trust our own perceptions again after years of having them distorted by addiction. "I'm taking it one day at a time," she told me over coffee last week, echoing the mantra that has become a touchstone for both of us. Brandon and I have started couples counseling, but I'm not making any decisions about our future yet. I need to focus on my own recovery first. My financial situation remains challenging. Diane Matthews has been invaluable, helping me navigate the complex process of disputing fraudulent accounts, clearing fraudulent charges, and rebuilding my credit. We've created a sustainable budget that allows me to continue working part-time at the cafe while preserving what remains of my retirement funds. It's not the golden years I once envisioned, but there's dignity in this new plan and a hard-earned wisdom about what truly constitutes security. Timothy visits more frequently now. The tension that once characterized our relationship dissolved by our shared experience of the intervention and its aftermath. Last Sunday, he helped me plant a garden in the backyard, something I'd always wanted but never found the energy to create while managing Brandon's constant crises. "Next spring, you'll have flowers," he promised, patting the soil around a dormant bulb. The simple pleasure of planning for a future season felt revolutionary. Grace remains my steadfast friend, a witness to both my darkest moments and my gradual rebirth. "You look younger," she remarked recently as we walked through Riverside Park. "Not your face necessarily, but your spirit. You move differently now." She was right. The constant weight of fear and responsibility I'd carried for so long had physically manifested in hunched shoulders, cautious steps, a hesitation in my movements. As that burden lifted, my body responded, standing straighter, moving more freely. reclaiming the physical space that is rightfully mine. Dr. Chen continues to guide me through the ongoing work of establishing healthy boundaries, not just with Brandon, but in all my relationships. The skills you're developing aren't just about addiction, he explained during a recent session. They're about honoring your own worth, your own right to peace and safety. These are lifelong tools. Officer Morgan checks in periodically, his professional concern evolving into something more like friendship. He brought his wife to the cafe last month, introducing me with a warmth that acknowledged our connection went beyond the official capacity that brought him into my living room on intervention day. As for Brandon and me, we're building something new from the ashes of our old relationship. It's tentative, fragile in some ways, but also more authentic than what we've had for years. We speak on the phone weekly, our conversations no longer dominated by financial requests or crisis management. Instead, we talk about his therapy insights, my garden plans, books we've read, ordinary things that most mothers and sons take for granted. During our last call, he said something that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. I always thought you were the weak one, Mom, that I could manipulate you because you weren't strong enough to stand up to me. I never understood that it took more strength for you to keep loving me through all of it than it would have to just cut me off. The words brought tears to my eyes, not because they absolved him of responsibility, but because they reflected a growing awareness of the complexity of our shared history. Neither of us is simply victim or villain in this story. We are two flawed human beings who lost our way and are now, step by step, finding a path back to each other and to ourselves. I share this story now, not because it has a perfect ending. It doesn't. Brandon's recovery is ongoing, one day at a time. My financial rebuilding will take years. Trust, once broken, mends slowly. But I share it because I know there are others out there like me, people silently drowning in a loved one's addiction, believing they have no choice but to keep enabling, keep rescuing, keep sacrificing themselves on the altar of misplaced loyalty. If you're watching this and recognizing yourself in my story, please know that there is another way. It isn't easy and it isn't painless, but it is possible to reclaim your life, to love without enabling, to support without self-destruction. The resources that helped me, Al-Anon, therapy, supportive friends, legal advice, financial counseling, are available to you too. You are not alone, though addiction is masterful at making you feel isolated. This has been one of the most challenging videos I've ever made for the Revenge Expected channel. Reliving these moments, speaking these truths aloud, it takes me back to places I'd rather not revisit. But if my experience helps even one person find the courage to set boundaries, to seek help, to break the cycle of addiction in their family, then the vulnerability is worthwhile. If you've connected with my story, please take a moment to subscribe to Revenge Expected. Each week, we share stories of people who have found the strength to stand up for themselves after years of manipulation or mistreatment. These aren't simple revenge tales. They're complex human journeys toward dignity and self-respect. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or your own experience. The community that has formed in our comment section provides support and understanding that can be life-changing for those still trapped in situations like mine. Your voice, your story matters. It might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If you found value in this video, please consider hitting the like button or sharing it with someone who might benefit from hearing that they're not alone in their struggle. And if you're able, we would be deeply grateful if you could support our channel through Super Thanks. Your financial contribution helps cover the production costs of creating these videos daily and allows us to reach more people who need to hear these stories of transformation. The work of documenting these journeys is not always easy. Each video represents hours of interviews, careful editing, and the emotional labor of holding space for difficult truths. Your support through Super Thanks directly enables us to continue this work, to bring more stories of courage and boundary setting to light each day. Before I close, I want to say one final thing to anyone still in the midst of loving someone with addiction. The day I stopped being afraid of my own son was the day I truly became his mother again. Not his enabler, not his victim, but his mother. Someone who loved him enough to stand firm, to demand better, to believe in his capacity for change even when he couldn't see it himself. That kind of love is harder but infinitely more powerful than the enabling that masquerades as love, and you are strong enough to offer it, even when it feels impossible. Thank you for witnessing my journey. Until next time, this is Judith from Revenge Expected, reminding you that sometimes the most unexpected form of revenge is simply reclaiming your own life.